Across time, we've lost empires, languages, even entire civilizations. But none of those losses compare to what quietly vanished from the human species just a few thousand years ago. You see, your DNA, made up of about 3.2 billion base pairs, is more than a biological instruction manual. It's a time capsule, a forensic record, and sometimes it tells stories that history never wrote down. One of those stories is a statistical impossibility. At some point during the late Stone Age, the genetic record shows that nearly all human males vanished. Not a few tribes, not a region, not one continent, almost everywhere. Scientists found that the diversity of the Y-chromosome, the strand of DNA passed from father to son, collapsed by as much as 95% in parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. That's the kind of number you'd expect from a nuclear war. Only this happened before writing, before nations, before recorded history. Even more bizarre, women's DNA wasn't affected. Mitochondrial diversity stayed stable, even increased in some areas, which means whatever happened, it specifically targeted men. But there were no written records, no ancient epics or king lists telling of a great purge. Only graves, mass graves, dismembered skeletons, villages surrounded by fortifications that clearly didn't work. The kind of evidence that suggests this wasn't a single battle. It wasn't even a war. It was something deeper, more universal. A shared instinct to wipe out competing bloodlines and take their place. One clan, one village, one chromosome at a time. And in this episode, we're going to uncover what really happened. Not just by looking at bones and weapons, but by reading the scars etched into our own chromosomes. This isn't just the story of prehistoric violence. It's the reason your father's lineage almost never existed. When researchers began sequencing human genomes in detail, they weren't looking for signs of ancient violence. They were tracing ancestry, mapping migrations, and trying to understand how modern populations evolved. But then they noticed something odd, something that didn't add up. Across widely separated populations, from Europe to the Middle East to parts of Asia and North Africa, there was a sudden and synchronized collapse in Y chromosome diversity. It looked like somewhere between 4,000 to 7,000 years ago, a massive number of male genetic lines had simply disappeared. Now in genetics, a bottleneck usually points to a sharp drop in population. It can happen from disease, climate disasters, famine, anything that kills large numbers. But here's the twist. This bottleneck affected only the Y chromosome, which is passed exclusively from father to son. Meanwhile, mitochondrial DNA, which follows the maternal line, stayed healthy and stable. In plain terms, women survived. Men didn't. In fact, the numbers are staggering. Some regions show losses of up to 95% in Y chromosome variation. To match that in today's world, it would be like wiping out 3.9 billion men, leaving just a few hundred million alive. It wasn't gradual either. This change happened over the course of just a few dozen generations. This wasn't just a demographic shift. It was a genetic extinction event. But strangely, only for one half of the species. Naturally, scientists scrambled for explanations. Could it have been a natural disaster that affected only men? A disease that targeted the male genome? Unlikely. If it were an act of nature, both genders should have suffered equally. But this bottleneck had a fingerprint, and that fingerprint looked human. The most plausible theory? Systematic, organized, intergroup violence. Tribes or clans wiping out rival males, not by chance, but by intention. Eliminating fathers, brothers, and sons, and taking control of the surviving women and children. And this wasn't a one-off event. It happened again and again, across regions thousands of miles apart. A coordinated global conspiracy isn't likely, but a shared strategy born from human nature. That's another story. Genetics gave us the warning, but bones gave us the proof. If this mysterious bottleneck was the result of violence, there should be bodies, and there are, hundreds of them, buried in shallow pits, with skulls split wide, limbs hacked off, and no sign of burial rites or peace. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of late Neolithic massacre sites across Europe and Western Asia, each telling the same chilling story. At the Talheim death pit in Germany, dated to around 5000 BC, scientists found the remains of 34 individuals, men, women, and children. All showed signs of brutal execution, with head wounds so precise they suggested intentional, repeated killing blows. But what made Talheim even more disturbing was who wasn't there. Young adult women were notably absent. It's as if the attackers didn't just kill, they selected. Nearby in Austria, at a site called Schletz, the horror scaled up. Over 200 victims, many tossed into mass graves without care. Again, women and children were underrepresented, and this time, many of the corpses were found missing limbs and skulls, as if dismembered on purpose, either during or after death. These weren't battlefield casualties. These were massacres, quick, vicious, and organized, and they weren't rare. Archaeologists estimate that at least 10% of Neolithic human remains in some regions show signs of lethal violence. In one Spanish study of 138 individuals, 23% bore weapon-inflicted injuries, mostly on adolescent and adult males, and that's just the visible trauma. Researchers note that over 80% of fatal injuries from blunt or soft tissue attacks leave no mark on bone at all, meaning the real numbers were likely far higher. This evidence forms a grim pattern. Raiding parties, clan-based warfare, and systematic male elimination. Not for defense, not for survival, but for dominance. Because in this brutal age, the most efficient way to erase a rival wasn't to conquer them. It was to wipe out their sons and take their daughters. And the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't just a prehistoric crime scene. It was a strategy. The question isn't just how so many men vanished. It's why. What could have pushed entire communities to turn against each other with such brutality, wiping out entire male lineages in the process? To understand that, we need to step back and look at what was happening to humanity around 10,000 years ago. Because just before this male bottleneck, the world changed, and it changed fast. This was the Neolithic Revolution, the moment humans shifted from roaming hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. For the first time in history, people stayed put. They planted crops, built permanent homes, raised animals, and formed villages. It sounds peaceful, but it wasn't. Farming didn't just produce food. It produced borders. Land became valuable. Surplus crops could be stolen. Water sources, grazing fields, even grain storage. Everything had a price. And when one group had what another lacked, conflict followed. Suddenly, raiding became profitable. And here's the dark part. Killing rival males wasn't just vengeance. It was tactical. By eliminating the adult men of a neighboring tribe, you wiped out its leadership, its defense, and most importantly, its genetic future. But these weren't nation-states with generals and armies. These were kin-based groups, bound by blood and trust. They didn't make peace with outsiders. They destroyed them. As social structures shifted, so did mating strategies. Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests the rise of patrilineal clans, groups that traced descent through male ancestors only. And that's important, because once you rely on male descent for inheritance, identity, and power, Other male bloodlines become competition. This wasn't just war, it was selective erasure, a prehistoric game of thrones played in real villages, with real blades and real consequences for who got to father the next generation. Women, on the other hand, were often taken, not because they were spared out of mercy, but because they were viewed as valuable reproductive resources. And over time, this process repeated, again and again. Across valleys, river plains, forests, and mountains, wherever clans came into contact, one lineage had to fall. The result wasn't just cultural destruction, it was genetic. So far, we've seen strategic killing, but some sites suggest something more disturbing. Not just war, but ritualized horror. Enter Herxheim, a small Neolithic settlement in what's now southwestern Germany. At first glance, it looks like any other early farming community. But just outside its ancient walls, archaeologists found something unimaginable. Over 80 separate pits, each one packed with broken, burned, and butchered human bones. More than 1,000 individuals. Possibly closer to 1,500 men. Women, elders, newborns, stacked, disassembled, and discarded. But it wasn't just a mass grave. These bodies were processed. Skulls were neatly split along the center. Long bones cracked open to access the marrow. Tongues removed. Hands and feet gnawed. Some bones even show signs of having been cooked over fire or spit roasted. Others were carved into tools, cups, and ornaments. And then it gets weirder. Many of these bodies came from outside Herxheim. Isotope analysis revealed they weren't locals. Some came from over 300 miles away, from mountain regions, lowlands, even coastal plains. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was systematic collection. So what was going on? Some researchers believe Herxheim was the home of a skull cult, a community that conducted ritual cannibalism, not out of desperation, but as part of a belief system. A city that raided neighboring groups, captured outsiders, and sacrificed them in elaborate ceremonies. Others think it was about control through terror, a political weapon, not a spiritual one. A warning: resist us, and this is where you'll end up, boiled and buried beneath our walls. And then, just like that, the settlement vanishes. There's no sign of a violent invasion, but within 50 years of the last burial, Herxheim was abandoned. No rebuild, no rebirth, just silence. Did another group wipe them out? Did their own practices collapse under moral or social strain? Or did their neighbors finally decide? Enough was enough. Whatever happened, Herxheim proves one thing. Prehistoric violence wasn't just brutal. It could be theatrical, ritualized, and deeply planned. And it was far from the only place with that kind of darkness. The evidence is overwhelming. Thousands of bodies, dozens of massacre sites, clear signs that men were targeted, and yet, genetically speaking, that was only the beginning of the mystery. Because while archaeology shows the weapons, the wounds, and the bones, DNA reveals something even more specific. It wasn't just men dying. It was male lineages being erased. This brings us back to the Y-Chromosome bottleneck, the strange collapse in male genetic diversity that left only a small handful of surviving lines. Even in regions where population numbers eventually recovered, Y-chromosome variation didn't, and it still hasn't fully recovered today. So why was the male genome hit so hard while mitochondrial DNA, the female line, stayed intact? One compelling theory points to the rise of patrilineal kinship structures during the Neolithic era. In these systems, power, property, and identity were passed from father to son, making bloodline everything. But this came with a vulnerability. If a clan lost its men, its entire lineage died with them. Meanwhile, Women moved freely between groups, married out, traded, or taken after raids, so their genetic line kept flowing, adapting, surviving. The result? Massive loss of male variation, but a steady stream of female diversity. But not all scholars agree this was purely the work of violence. Some propose a subtler possibility, that male lineages faded over time due to lineal fission, peaceful group splits where one subgroup struggled reproductively while another thrived. Over generations, dominant male lines would expand and fracture repeatedly, leaving weaker ones to quietly vanish. Still, others argue it was both, a deadly combination of war, dominance, and reproductive success, where a few powerful males fathered the majority of the next generation, while entire other lineages were erased by blade, neglect, or exclusion. And this wasn't theoretical. Similar reproductive patterns have been documented in surviving tribal societies today, where 1 to 3 men may father the majority of children in the group, while others are cut off entirely. Whatever the mix of causes, the effect was the same. A thinning of the Y-chromosome so severe, your father's DNA nearly never made it into the future. At first glance, all this violence might seem isolated, local clan rivalries, a handful of massacres scattered across ancient Europe. But when researchers started piecing the data together, from DNA studies, archaeological digs, and isotope analysis, a chilling pattern began to emerge. This wasn't a local conflict. It was everywhere, from the steppes of Central Asia to the Nile River basin, from the megalithic coasts of Britain to the mountain valleys of Iran. Communities were building fortifications, burying their dead in mass pits, and selectively erasing male lineages from the gene pool. Even in regions without written history, the pattern was unmistakable: a sharp decline in male genetic diversity, a rise in conflict-related trauma, and a cultural shift from open mobility to closed, defensive tribalism. This raises an uncomfortable question. Was this the first global war? To be clear, we're not talking about nations or emperors. There were no flags, no borders, but the mechanics of violence, organized raids, clan dominance, selective killings, appeared across multiple continents within the same time window, and many of these groups never met, which suggests something deeper than imitation, something rooted in human behavior itself. Even in the Pacific, in places like Papua New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago, DNA evidence hints at similar male line collapses, occurring thousands of miles away, yet during the same prehistoric period. So, what do we call it when violence erupts independently across half the globe, driven by the same evolutionary pressures: territory, reproduction, survival, and ends with the same result? If not a war, then perhaps an era, a global prehistoric age of conflict, waged not by armies, but by bloodlines. And unlike modern wars, there were no treaties, no victors, only survivors, and the fragile DNA we inherited from them. So how did it end? How did humanity move from a world where men were slaughtered by the tens of thousands to one where you're more likely to die from a bad diet than a blade to the head? The truth is, it didn't end. It evolved. Over time, populations grew faster than they were killed. Settlements merged into proto-cities. Trade routes replaced raid paths. And when cooperation became more profitable than conquest, violence lost its appeal. But the impulse, the blueprint for conflict, never vanished. We still see the echoes in territorial instincts, in political tribalism, in wars that never quite go extinct, but only lie dormant between innovations. Yet the prehistoric age of annihilation did cool down, and not just because we got wiser, but because we got bigger. larger societies diluted the impact of bloodline warfare. A few men losing their lives no longer meant a whole tribe vanished. Writing helped, law helped, religion, diplomacy, trade, and even shared myths began pulling people together under common identities, and lifespans began to rise, from a brutal 25 to 30 years during the Neolithic bloodbath, to over 70 today in most parts of the world. The wars didn't stop, but the extinction of entire male lineages, that did, mostly. Because now, for the first time in history, a man can leave no sons, and still leave a legacy. Still, we carry the scars, in the reduced diversity of our chromosomes, in our cultural fear of the outsider, and in the violent myths we retell over and over across every civilization. But here's the difference. Now we know. We can read the war written in our blood, and we can choose not to repeat it.